Greetings, travelers. Welcome to my campfire. If you've been following me from my first video, you know I'm primarily a fiction author, and if you know any fiction authors, you know that most of us are perpetually behind our deadlines. Such is the case with me, so since I have a lot of drafting I need to do to finish my next novel, rather than take the time to condense one of my gaming session notes down into a script for you all, I thought I would continue my break from the Dragon Heist story and do something a little different. I'm going to do a reading from the first novel in the series that I'm still working on, entitled Hand of Vengeance. If you've already read this book, then you can skip this one, but be sure to remember to give it a like and recommend it to your friends. And if you haven't read this book yet, then it will be a good preview for you. So I'm going to read the prologue and the first chapter. Two men stood in a barren field, silent shadows amidst rising twilight mist. Their silhouettes stood apart from a dozen-strong contingent of friends and allies a few yards ahead as they watched the eastern stars wink out one by one in the van of the coming dawn. One man was clearly the elder of the two, but they shared eyes too haunted, hands too bloodstained. The older, thicker of the pair broke the silence first. "I thought you might go yourself, my lord." "You've seen her eyes these past months, my friend," the younger, more refined man replied. "She's not been the same since he fell. All the rage that was in her when first she came to us, it's consumed her all over again." "And you think one stroke will change all that?" "That she must choose, but I'll not rob her of the chance. Vengeance is her nature, after all." "And her name." "Of course." So it was that Baraxis, Lord of Southerset and Major of the Storm River Bridge Battalion, had sent his hand of vengeance to do her work. A fiery dream melted into darkness as the sleeping orc snapped open his eyes, quickly absorbing all around him. Everything at the edges of his vision was as it should be, his gear, weapons, and trophies showing dimly in the dawn light that filtered through the seams of his tent. In the center of his view, however, staring straight into his bleary eyes, stood a vision of terror. A nightmarish demon spat up from the bowels of hell, or so his people believed. Still, it bore a human shape, a lithe woman with a mass of hair falling down her back, red and wild as flame. A heavy cloak of green and black shrouded her form, but the dull glint of mail beneath gave proof to her violent intentions. A flash of gold-trimmed scarlet tied about her right arm, and the bloody gleam of a garnet in her cloak clasp matched a hellish, inhuman glow behind her piercing green eyes that held the orcs even as they cowed him. It was the battle light, sparked by the imminence of blood. For all the many rumors of this demon, the light in her eyes was unknown to all who faced her, for no enemy seeing that glint had lived to tell the tale. To the orcish captain, prostrate, unarmed, helpless beneath that burning stare, nothing could provoke more terror. His mind screamed for flight or battle, but those eyes held him, searing away his courage and replacing it with the certainty that any movement could only hasten his death. "You know why I'm here, who I am," asserted the demon in a fair mimicry of the orc's brutish tongue. "I know who you are, Hellwitch," he grunted, biding his time while his mind scrabbled for anything that might save him, "but not what you are. If I'm dead anyway, tell me that secret." The orc was denied even that, for the answer, the last words he would ever hear, came in a tongue he did not understand. The woman straightened to her considerable height, pointing a great sword at the prone orc's throat. "I am Gwen et Shivasa," she proclaimed. "I am the Hand of Vengeance." She swung her blade once, severing the orc's foul head from its body. Lifting the skull by the horsehair adhered to its bald pate, she stepped silently out of the tent, turning her gaze to a shoulder-high spear buried half-first in the ground, a trophy pole, lashed with crossbars from which hung the trinkets and pieces of the orc's human victims. She slammed the orc's head onto the spear point, then, with a decisive jerk, removed a single ring of silver and crystal from the pole. Drawing her cloak more tightly about her shoulders, she mounted her gray stallion and rode slowly out of the sleeping orcish camp, sitting proud in the saddle, a ghostly figure in the gray light and mist that rise with the dawn. After a few long moments she reached the line of soldiers in the field and their commander, Baraxis, a man she had grown to trust and respect over the past 18 months, months which weighed like years. As Gwen drew abreast to them, an older sergeant threw her a red towel on which she cleaned her gore-stained blade before wiping her bloodied hands. As she finished, she looked up to meet Baraxis' coal-black eyes, reading the unspoken question behind them. She nodded her head, silent at first, then said, "It's done. I have avenged our fallen brother, as I swore I would the day he fell and every day thereafter. But there are more deaths unanswered, more scales yet to balance." She cast a backward glance at the orcish camp, her eyes narrow with contempt. "Burn it." As fire arrows arced through the dawn sky, searing trails through the mist like deadly rainbows, Gwen watched the first canvases of the small tent city ignite. Most of the orcs fled, but she had put an end to the one they came for. Baraxis looked sidelong into Gwen's eyes, watching the reflection of the flames that danced there, wondering what she would do next, and, after she'd done it, whether either of them could find their way again. Chapter 1. Years, leagues, lives, and worlds before, other flames burned, candles and hearths smoking into the cold night in a well-furnished longhouse. Cozy as the place was, for the past few months it had always seemed inexplicably cold. Gladness and laughter were now strangers here. A tall, broad man, his sandy hair unkempt, leaned against a windowsill, facing grimly into the west and watching the tops of the nearby forest pines whip and sway under the force of a harsh northern wind. Craig, the little wanderer, rose quickly in the west, a faint glimmer through the treetops, while the larger moon, Eridan, the faithful one, rode high and full, shedding its brighter light over the surrounding village. Glancing back into the house, he scratched his head while gazing at a strange contraption of levers, counterweights, and slowly flowing sand, doing his best to reckon the hours since sunset. Timekeeping devices were foreign to him, for he had been born into a poor family that followed the old traditions, and to whom such amenities were not destined. Still, he was clever enough and figured another 3 hours before the dawn. Even for her first child, it was beyond the realm of hope that Lisha's labor would take that much longer. With that very thought, a tiny but forceful cry ripped through the sound of the howling wind, carrying all the power only such a cry could. Strength, pain, love, confusion, courage, fear, the burning desire to survive as a new soul wills itself into existence, proclaiming boldly to the world that it has a new master. Despite all this sublime beauty, the man by the window felt a chill tear up and down his spine as though the fingers of death had raked his back, for in his heart he heard only the cry of a frightful creature, the cry of a wind-born child. And in that cry his mind could focus only on that which he did not hear, that which gives purpose to the newborn will, a note absent from the birth cry of all wind-born children, the sound of hope. Sometime later the man leaned against the same windowsill, gazing at the wind as the midwife approached him softly from behind. "They're asleep," she said flatly. "I told you this would go badly, midwife," the man replied, spite edging the brusqueness in his voice. "What badly?" the midwife replied. "Mother and child are both alive and healthy, and the babe may be the strongest I've brought into this world, and that's a large group." The man looked sidelong at the midwife, the pain of a wife and newborn lost under her care still fresh in his eyes these years later, though the rage was left behind. "Strongest maybe, and maybe that's my fear," he answered. "The Windborn need no strength to power their madness." "Windborn, Tegel? I know your family had always followed the old ways, but I thought you greater than that superstition." "It's no superstition. I've been in battle with Windborn, both beside and against. Trust my experience. The Windborn are mad." "Well, it's all moot," the midwife replied with a tired sigh. "There shan't be much of battle for this child. Lisha had a lass." "The women of Atland are free to rally to arms if it suits them." "Aye, they may, but why should they? They learn early from their own mothers the rewards of bringing new life into the world. Only death rewards the soldier. I don't expect Lisha will teach any differently." "You've not heard, then?" Tegel inquired, at last turning fully toward the small woman. "Heard what?" "What shall name the child." "You know it's bad luck for a midwife to know before, and you lecture me about superstition. Get on with it, Tegel." The large man paused, then, "The child's to be called Gwen et Shivasa." "Gwen et Shivasa? That's no name for a lass. That's no name at all." "No, it is not," Tegel replied. "She isn't the same, midwife. Since Goral was killed, there's been naught in here but anger and hate and the guilt of the living. I know it's only been a few months, but she doesn't grieve as one must grieve." For a moment, Tegel's words called back the midwife's pain over each child and mother she had lost. Though the number was small, smaller indeed than it might have been under less skilled hands, each face was a wound on her soul. Her next words were measured with care. "You came through that dark better than most who have wandered it, and your counsel would be wise, but take care how you give it. You know each must weather that storm in his own way, and Lisha must weather it in hers." "Until tonight I would agree, but now there is the child to consider." "It would go better with the right father." The midwife laid her hand on Tegel's right arm. Tegel recoiled from the touch in disgust. "I'll not marry my best friend's widow." "And I'd never suggest such a thing, though you must know he'd not blame you if your hearts tended that way. I only meant that you could watch over the mother and child, and see that little Gwyn grows up well." Tegel shuddered at the word. "I love Lisha as a sister. I've barely left this house since we lost Goral. There's always been work to do, old chinking, bad patches in the thatch. I didn't risk my life bringing Goral's blade back to his home only to watch it crumble. I'd die before I'd leave Lisha to fend for herself. More important, taking care of the child was the last thing Goral asked me to do, and I will, like she was my own. But I'll never get used to that name. 8 years later. Gwen darted between market stalls, listening for the sounds of clumsy grown-up pursuit behind her. Her stepfather was hunting for her again, and she hated him. Even here, in the chaos of clan meet, he seemed to be everywhere, insisting she help herd her stupid half-brothers, or worse yet, play with them, or trying to make her presentable. He insisted these orders for grooming came from her mother, but Gwen knew he was lying. She slid under a wheelbarrow and lay still, holding her breath. Ages crawled by as she waited for the coast to clear. People laughed and haggled all around, a good joke for a mug of ale, a better one or a few pieces of copper for mead, a bushel of apples for a tunic, a horse for a fine sword. Warriors bragged over new scars, a new wife, a new baby, not necessarily in that order. The sun warmed the ground, but here in the shadow of the barrow the autumn air was cool, the soil damp. Gwen loved the clan meet. The descent of cold from the mountains meant the grip of winter and her birthday were both coming nearer. Better still, the clan meet meant contests against children from other families and clans, boys and girls she hadn't already bested 1,000 times over as she had the ones in her own village. She knew all the northwestern tartans. Next year she'd be big enough to carry the Camden standard herself in parade. Cart was everywhere, as their village hosted this year. Dunry and Dextra had arrived yesterday noon, Andish and Barden last evening, and Vasson just this forenoon. Maybe after she won at wrestling tomorrow morning, she'd ask to do foot races with the 10 and 11-year-olds so she could show her mother how fast she'd gotten. Suddenly a boot, one Gwen knew too well, smote the ground before her eyes. The shade of the wheelbarrow erupted into dazzling light, and Gwen braced her feet to bolt away. Before she could move, a meaty hand grabbed a fistful of her smock and hauled her upward, the uncoiling springs of her legs pushing against nothing but air. She windmilled her arms, but could not reach her abductor. "Put me down!" she shrieked. "Little Gwen, where in all the hells have you been?" Tegel sighed from behind her. "Under the wheelbarrow," she answered, her hand still grabbing for some purchase on Tegel's arm or shirt front. "I can see that, but where before? Ugh, by Terrala, you stink!" Tegel put her down, still holding one of her little hands in his great paw, and led her through the crowds as she gawped at swords and hauberks of mail. "I went to the stables to see Clan Cart's best horses," she finally answered. "Went to them or rolled in them? One of the stable boys challenged me to a duel, so— Whoa!" They had reached the edge of a nearby stream, and Gwen suddenly felt herself heaved off the ground and into the water, flailing as she broke the surface with a mighty splash. She heard laughter as her head came back into the air and looked toward the sound to see 2 women washing clothes at the bank, chuckling at how she'd been dunked. She stuck her tongue out at them. "Now scrub the worst of that off while I go find your mother," Tegel ordered. "If you don't get cleaned up, she won't let you go to the feast tonight. I ought to tell Adric I finally ran you to ground, too." "I hate Adric," Gwen pouted. "Gwen of the family Camden, I don't want to hear you talk like that. What harm has Adric ever done you?" "He locks me in the storeroom." "Your storeroom hasn't got a door." "Some other storeroom," Gwen mumbled. "Besides, he's just a dumb farmer, not a warrior like you." "And who do you suppose feeds the warriors? And the saucy little girls," he called over his shoulder as he left. Gwen began scrubbing at herself with her hands as she waited for the inevitable soap bar and hairbrush. Why couldn't Tegel be her stepfather? Gwen loved the clan meet feast. No hall in any town could hold everyone, so they spread out on trestle tables around roaring bonfires on the village green. The food was the best any of them would eat all year. The speeches were boring, of course, and the other children mostly babbled about stupid things, but the best warriors would stand and tell tales of their deeds long into the night. By the end, some of them were always drunk, which a few of the grown-ups would scoff at, but sometimes they flailed about too much and fell down, and that was funny. Even better, every few years the king would attend. He was a distant kinsman, but Gwen didn't particularly care about him. What she appreciated was his bodyguard, the best fighters in all the land, almost as good as her father would have been, and with the best weapons and mail. She was getting too old now to clearly remember the last time they'd come to her clan meet, and every year she hoped this would be the next time. Bia Craig sailed dimly overhead, but Aradan didn't shine that night, leaving the green to no light but the bonfires as the children all sat around a trio of tables at the foot of the long feasting area. Gwen was used to the order of serving at regular meals, women with child, then warriors, then children, then other grown-ups. At the feast, though, there was so much food everybody just took and ate what they wanted all at once. Most of the serving platters were too big for the children to pass themselves, so parents or older siblings would take it in turn to fill the plates of the young. Her half-brother Aldrin was a few chairs down. Gwen was supposed to be sitting next to him, but she managed to shift away once the littler ones started getting bored and running around between plates. A few tables away, on the left side of the green, she could see her mother sitting with Adric and the new baby Lyrish. Adric played with and fed his son as Lisha held him. Adric's love for the boy was plain on his face, as plain as Lisha's vigilance over him, but Lisha didn't smile. Gwen thought she seemed to be enjoying the feast, but she never smiled. except when Gwyn won things. Tegel sat farther away on the right with some of the older warriors, listening and nodding his head. A woman, maybe older than Gwyn's mother and with soft brown hair, approached the table from the light of the bonfires. Bearing a tray of meat, she started at the left end of the children's tables and began placing cuts on each empty plate. Some with other food left uneaten clamored for more of the juicy roast, but she always refused them with a "Tut-tut, finish what you have first." She stopped in front of Gwyn, noticing a pastry still on her plate. "I never asked for that," Gwyn insisted. "Meat makes you strong, sweets make you fat." "A child as raw-boned as you could use a little fat, young Gwyn." "How do you know my name?" "Oh, I know all the children hereabouts," the woman answered with a dismissive wave of the hand that wasn't under the platter. "Someone has to keep you little scamps from getting into mischief in the woods." "I can't go in the woods by myself," Gwyn pouted. "There's a bad wizard that lives too close." "Yes, I know," the woman acknowledged with a solemn nod of her head. She looked to either side and saw the children nearest were distracted with talk or play. "Here, I'll make an exception for a growing warrior like you." She set a piece of braised beef on Gwyn's plate as the girl made her most savage war face. The older woman moved on down the table with a clear, free laugh, one that made Gwyn wish, for just half a heartbeat, her mother would laugh that way sometimes. She turned back to her food as a warrior from Dextra stood to tell a tale. The young ones all around her made so much noise she had to strain to hear the burly man as he swung his ale mug about like a war mace, recounting his deeds against the nomads far to the east when, being a bachelor in a quiet town, he had traveled there to help repel raids. Gwyn barely noticed when something bumped her left knee. She jabbed back in that direction to knock away whatever nearby child encroached on her space. When something brushed her left foot, she had to look under the table to see what was going on. A boy, a little older than her, crouched on his knees and tried to lift up the skirts of the older girl to Gwyn's left. "Hey!" Gwyn called, stomping hard on the boy's left hand. The boy howled and scrambled away, but Gwyn stood up, putting all her weight on her left foot, trapping the hand. She could now just see the boy's right arm on the other side of the table as he pulled hard to free himself, his hand wrenching from under the leather sole of her shoe. As the boy tumbled back, Gwyn jumped onto the table and climbed over, standing above him. "Don't be looking up girls' skirts, you cur!" she yelled as the taller boy stood. He looked her once up and down. "Don't worry," he said. "I wouldn't have bothered looking up yours." Gwyn swung her fist faster than an eye blink and with accuracy that belied her few years. The boy reeled back, holding his hands over his nose as blood ran down his chin. Children nearby yelled, "Fight! Fight!" Others farther down the table, likely too far to have seen anything, took up the call until it became a regular chant. Gwyn stood with her feet wide, left forward, and her tiny fists balled in front of her. "Come on, you snake! Rat! Bastard!" The final insult seemed to spark enough rage to overcome pain, and Gwyn waited for the charge, grinning for the chance to wallop the older boy. Before anything else could happen, Adric burst in between the two youngsters, spreading his arms to hold them apart. "Gwyn, what are you doing?" "He was looking up girls' skirts." "I was not," the boy insisted. "No more lies and excuses, Gwyn," Adric demanded. "You apologize." "Why should she apologize for winning?" Lisha asked, strolling up from behind with the baby on her hip. "Is your hand all right, Gwyn?" "You know Tegel taught me how to punch right," she answered with defiance. Other grown-ups started gathering. Two separated from the crowd and took hold of the bleeding boy, pulling his hands from his face to look at his nose. "I don't think it's broken," one of them muttered. The man stood up and stared at Adric, his hand pointing at Gwyn. "Are you going to whip this sassy brat, or should I?" Before Adric could say a word, Lisha had handed him the baby and squared up with the larger man. "Nobody lays a hand on my girl for winning a fight. If your little milksop wants to see her beaten, let him do it for himself. If he can." Gwyn could see the father's eyes flashing in the firelight. He was about ready to make a challenge. Maybe he would whoop Adric. That would be fun to see. "If she's not punished, then it's between us," the man growled. "And me," came Tegel's voice as he shouldered through the crowd of adults. "This girl is my oath daughter. Did anyone see who started things?" "She started it," the boy cried. "Anyone else?" Tegel asked. "Are you calling my boy a liar?" the father demanded. "Are you calling my oath daughter one?" Tegel's voice was flat and cold. It held no bravado but brooked no argument unless it were backed by a challenge. The other man went quiet, the tension in his body dissipating. "Shake hands," he finally ordered his son. "But Papa, shake hands!" Gwyn was a better winner than loser. She knew she would have refused if the situation was reversed, but she extended her hand and waited. The boy gave the briefest of squeezes, then hurried off under the custody of his mother. "Back to the tent, little Gwyn," Tegel ordered. "But—" "No buts. The next father whose son you beat may not be so easy to talk down." "Now, Tegel," Lisha soothed. "He's right, Lisha," Adric muttered. "She needs at least a shred of discipline." Lisha relented with a nod, but she flashed Gwyn one of her rare smiles before Tegel ushered the girl away. The woman with the meat tray looked on from the far end of the children's table, her face impassive. 2 years later. Gwen sat at the foot of the heavy table in her house, bouncing her heel on the floor. Tegel sat at her left with a mild smile. Lisha was at her right, her hands hidden under the table. Adric was off farming someplace. Gwen's stomach ached from her birthday breakfast, but she had one more bite to finish before she could have her present. She picked up the piece of bacon with greasy fingers, exhaling a weary breath before shoving it into her mouth, chewing a few times and swallowing. Now? Lisha revealed the secret she had been holding, a narrow bundle of dark plaid more than a foot long. Gwen unrolled it gingerly, revealing a short hilt protruding from a hard leather sheath. Her eyes lit up as she saw it, her smile broadening into a grin as she drew the single-edged dirk and examined it. The grip of dark wood was polished to a smooth luster, a joy simply to hold. The handle was wider at the blade and pommel. It would give a secure grip when her hand grew into it a bit more. The furniture was brass, the blade with a wide spine and narrow taper, perfect for stabbing. She gave a few experimental swings. Tegel smiled. Though Gwen had begun to take after her father's towering height, the knife still looked more like a short sword in her hand. He feared she was still a bit too young, but Lisha insisted the time had come for her to have a proper weapon. Lisha's eyes shone at Gwen's glee for the deadly instrument. "It's from both of us," she explained. "I decided to give you a good fighting knife for your 10th birthday, and Tegel chose all the particulars to tell the smith. Do you like it?" "I love it," Gwen exclaimed. "Thank you, Mama." "Thank you, Papa." Gwen's right cheek exploded with fiery pain, her head whipping to the side. Tears sprang to her eyes of their own accord as Tegel cried out in alarm. Gwen's jaw trembled, more with rage than hurt, as she looked back to her mother, her eyes aflame. "That is not your father," Lisha declared, pointing across the table. Her face, so pleased a moment ago, was twisted with anger. "Giral is your father, murdered over 10 years ago by the wizard Kelgor. How dare you try to replace him? I hope when the time comes you're still fit to avenge him." She stood and stomped to the narrow hall that led back into the bedchambers. "I'm sorry, Gwen," Tegel muttered. "It's my fault," she answered. "I shouldn't have said it. Not in front of your mother, anyway. I know it just came out, but it still meant something to me. I don't think your father would mind. It hurts your mother, though, so best not to say it again. I'll just know from now on." Gwen nodded. "Do you want to go get some training with your new knife? I don't have to patrol today." Gwen hesitated, then squeezed the hilt tighter in her hand. "Yes," she answered. "I do love it." She had to train hard enough to ensure she was, indeed, fit when the time came. 3 years later. Gwen sat in the crisp air of the clan meat feast. From her position at the far right end of the children's tables, she could see Tegel with the other warriors, but her mother and stepfather were invisible behind the glow of the nearest bonfire. She had no idea where her half-brothers were. The adults had long since given up asking Gwen to supervise them. Gwen did love the clan meet. Last year she had won wrestling and mock sword within her age group and had come in second and third overall in horsemanship and tracking. She competed in hunting but didn't care about her place. It was judged on the quality of the game harvested, and she only practiced it to hone her stealth. This year she would do better in all events. Despite her love for the contests, she loathed the feast. The food was fine, but the other children her age hated her because she always won, and the old warriors boasting over ancient victories was tiresome, sometimes even a little pathetic. Not one of them had the courage to lead an attack against the wizard that had murdered her father. Of course that was for the best, since Kelgor was hers to kill. Tegel would have had some decent stories, from defending the village against the wizard's minions, fell beasts and such, but he was too humble to tell them. A boy about Gwen's age approached with a full plate. She paid him no mind until he asked, "Can I sit here?" "Why?" she retorted. "There's a lot of empty chairs around you," he answered. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged. "Do what you want." She looked at him as he sat and realized she'd never seen him before, even at clan meet where she could meet people from farther villages. She certainly would have remembered him if she had, since he looked quite different from other Outlanders. His eyes and hair were dark, the latter a mass of tight ringlets. He had skin a couple shades darker than was common in the north, and his frame was at the narrow end of masculinity, even for his age. "Where do you come from?" Gwen asked. "Clan Balder," he answered as he picked at his meal. "My father's brought us west on some trade business, and the Dunree Elder invited us so we wouldn't miss out on clan meet altogether. And yes, my mother's from the nomads east of the mountains." "I didn't ask about that." "People always do." "People should mind their own business," Gwen grumbled. The boy looked over at her. "I'm Sudro," he announced. "You're Gwen?" "How do you know that?" "Everybody talks about you. They told me not to bother coming over here. Well, some told me to try, but then they laughed." Gwen snorted. "They can go to hell. None of them is worth a damn in a fight anyway." Sudro coughed. "No wonder you're so popular." "You don't need to be liked when you're the best." Her plate was empty, so she went to find a platter of something to bring back for herself and the little children. With any luck, some of them would follow her example closely enough to be useful when she needed them someday. The next morning began with horsemanship competitions. Gwyn took first place at maneuvers, but lost at jumping to none other than Sudro. Stranger from Balder, she grumbled as she led her sorrel courser to the next event. Shouldn't even been allowed to compete. Gwyn's family was well off, but not wealthy, certainly not enough to afford a second horse for her. This put her at a disadvantage against a few of her peers in the final event, a 4-furlong sprint, since her mount would be tired from the previous efforts. Still, she would take her animal over any 10 of their beasts anyway, and she knew how to ride him to ration his strength for the race. She stood with him on the starting line, waiting to mount until the last possible moment, chewing her lip as the other competitors gathered at the line. Sudro's win at the jumps had been the more decisive, putting him ahead on points. In order to win overall, she had to take first place in the sprint. In a few more minutes, all the competitors had gathered, and the judges came down the line with step stools to help the children mount. Gwyn refused such a crutch and half jumped, half heaved herself onto the saddle. Sudro, to her left, raised an eyebrow. Gwyn was sure this was for her unexpected strength, and not at how it torqued the horse's saddle. Once everyone had mounted, a judge walked the line and moved horses forward and back to ensure an even start. Gwyn watched his progress to the far end, where a younger boy struggled to control his animal. The unruly gray kept pushing forward over the scratch, despite the child's best efforts. "Hurry up!" Gwyn shouted first, and a few of the less patient riders joined her. After 3 failed attempts to correct his horse, the judge disqualified the boy, who led the gray stallion away from the line with a brooding air. At last the competitors stood ready, and the second starting judge, standing just to Sudro's left, slapped 2 planks of wood together with a clack. Gwyn put spurs to her sorrel and took off like a bowshot. Her horse was an eager sprinter, and she knew her best strategy was to let him take an early lead before any sense of tiredness could reach his equine brain. In the right edge of her vision, she saw 2 riders almost keeping pace, but Sudro, to her left, dropped away quickly. She smiled. What her opponents couldn't know was how she had trained for months with 40 pounds of sand strapped to her saddle in anticipation of the day this horse would carry her in full male hauberk. Now, with only her slight frame to bear, he continued to accelerate over another 50 yards, leaving the nearest challengers a few lengths behind. She laughed as the wind whipped her hair behind her, allowing the joy of her inevitable victory to surge up when she finished the 3rd furlong. She could now see the crowds gathered at the finish line, growing larger in her vision every moment as her courser threw turf into the air behind her. The dull, rhythmic thuds of another horse's hooves barely registered in her left ear as she continued forward. The nose of Sudro's peebled mare just entered her vision with 150 yards left to run. She pushed her beast, but already he gave everything he had left. The finish line was moments away, and now Sudro's horse was even with her stirrup. Her eyes and brain churned, judging distance, time, and speeds. It would be close. Closer than she would allow. Gwyn made a subtle lean and twitched her reins. Her horse, prepared by long hours of training, executed Gwyn's intent with a hard cut to the left, taking Sudro's mare completely off guard. She reared up in shock, tossing Sudro to the ground. Gwyn flew down the last 100 yards unopposed, her nearest competition barely making up any of the few lengths they had lost at the start. Gwyn threw her arms in the air, cheering herself and turning to the crowd. The applause came in sparse and weak, and she frowned as many in the crowd already dispersed. She saw Adric shake his head as he walked away with Aldrin and Lyrish. The finish line judge walked from the crowd, threading a strip of the Candon tartan through the ring on a carven medallion, but his tone was not congratulatory as he yelled, "Winner!" and handed the medal to Gwyn. Tegel and Lisha came only a few steps behind. Lisha wore a broad smile, but Tegel scowled. "That was wonderful, Gwyn," Lisha called, clapping her hands. "Nobody can best you in the wrestling and fighting tomorrow. You're sure to take at least 3 first-place medals this year." Gwyn beamed at her mother's approval until she turned to see the judges backslapping in congratulations and awarding the 2nd and 3rd place medals, placing them around the winners' necks after they'd dismounted. She looked down at her own medal in her fist with a frown. "That was a dirty play, Gwyn," Tegel scolded. Lisha protested as Gwyn replied, "I didn't do it. My courser doesn't like any horses sneaking up on his left. He just cut over on his own." "See," Lisha put in, "that other boy shouldn't have tried to come up so close." Sudro, meanwhile, now crossed the line, leading his mare. "Congratulations," he called over, his voice flat. "Too bad I won't be at your clan meet next year. I'd love a rematch." "Why wait?" Gwyn challenged. Sudro shook his head. "My horse is tired. She needs rest, not another sprint." "Hang the horses then. I'll race you on foot." Sudro shook his head with a snort. "You win." "Coward," Gwyn spat. Sudro kept walking. "If you say so, Candon." Gwyn finally dismounted. Lisha looked over her shoulder at a call from Adric in the distance and walked away. Tegel walked with Gwyn as she led her horse to the corral where the Candon animals were held. "Gural would have been prouder of a 2nd-place finish than knocking an opponent out the way you did," he admonished. "I told you," Gwyn complained, "it was the horse." Her control of the mount had been subtle, and Tegel's point of view had been from afar. As importantly, her voice carried no hint of deception. "I hope that's really true," Tegel replied. "Only you know for sure. There's no rule against what you did. It's meant to be training for warfare, after all. I've been the first to teach you not to fight fair when the fight is real. There's a place for honor in your life, though. Never forget that, little Gwyn." Tegel hurried away before Gwyn could protest. Neither noticed the older woman with soft brown hair listening from a respectful distance. True to Licia's prediction, Gwyn dominated the combat events the next day, and with tactics none could gainsay, though her savagery as always caused tongues to wag. She'd hoped to best Sudro, but he was knocked out early by other fighters in mock weapons and didn't compete in wrestling at all. Two older boys, both sons of master trackers, were in their last year of competition before attaining manhood and kept their places in the tracking event, relegating Gwyn to third. Several youths took better game in the hunt, but none as quietly as she did. Of course, the clans held a host of other events in logging, agriculture, husbandry, and crafts, but Gwyn ignored them all. Tegel's words still nagged at her. When she returned home, she hung her fighting medals, and even her third-place tracking award, on the wall with the others, but she threw the first-place horsemanship medal into a trunk and rarely looked at it again. There ends Chapter 1. So I hope you all enjoyed the reading. I know it's a little different than what I usually do on this channel, but especially if you haven't read the book, I hope you consider it a good preview. If you'd like to get a copy, you can head over to burnthemap.com/shop to find Hand of Vengeance there in both print and ebook forms. And I would love to get feedback on this video too, especially on the reading. I'm definitely going to do audio versions of my books in the somewhat near future. I know some audiobook fans put a premium on books that are read by the author. I'm curious to know if my voice is adequate for that, or if I should look for someone with a real radio voice to record them for me, and what everybody's thoughts are on that. So remember to like, subscribe, share with all your friends, leave me a comment with your feedback, and as always, until we meet again, keep your fire bright.